polyglot beliefs, nor would we probably have had Hermetic philosophy. They all seem to be more or less involved in this pattern. We also find rising in areas under general broad Roman influence, such as Judea, the rise of the Essenian cult, later the Kabbalists, and in North Africa the Jewish sect of the Therapeutae. We find men like Philo-Judaeus arising in this pattern for the first time, writing a work on religion in terms of comparative religion, in which, instead of deriving his total message from his own faith, he immediately began to use other faiths as means of explaining his own. This situation may be said to have broadly existed just at the critical period that most interests us. Nor can we overlook the fact that Christianity rose at precisely the same time, and that Christianity, as a structural faith, bore witness within itself again of a highly complicated intellectual, moral, aesthetic background, a background in which from the very beginning Christianity stood out against, for instance, the background of Orthodox Judaism. Here we have a faith emerging by a strenuous reform. Here we find this faith spreading almost like wildfire, extending through a highly conditioned society. Had Egypt, with its old gods, had its old impregnable position, had the ancient deities of Greece been firmly and completely dominant, and had the Latinized Greek gods of Rome had the strength and domination and complete authority that they had in the times of Numa, or even in the period of the first Caesars, we could not have imagined any polyglot or heterodox faith spreading through these areas without an immediate reaction that would have almost exterminated it. Instead of that, we find it reaching people who are already inquiring, who are already a little uncertain, who are already disillusioned in something. The great note of Judaism of the time was disillusionment. The ancient gods of Israel had not preserved their people from the tyranny of Rome or the tyranny of Herod. The old vows had been broken. The punishment of deity was upon a delinquent people. All these explanations, man's moral effort to avoid or evade the inevitable fact that as a sovereignty he had been defeated and enslaved. All this turmoil, all this increasing doubt, the power of Rome took away from nearly all these other peoples the absolute faith which they previously had in their own deities, and gave them no immediate transference of that faith to any other group of deities. And gradually out of this confusion appears to have arisen a kind of intellectual individuality, perhaps best represented by your eclectic philosophy. These people simply, as we said, went shopping intellectually. And they bought a little from this store and a little from that mart or shop. And they built together a philosophy based upon experience, justified by personal favor, and perhaps containing a beautiful assortment of partly digested inconsistencies, as in the very beautiful but not maturely organized meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Now, this perhaps is the answer, by a rather long roundabout road, but one that almost has to be covered, to the rise of the Corpus Hermeticum. It represents a natural instinct on the part of man, an instinct that we are feeling today, the instinct for the need for a substantial religious philosophy of life, an instinct that is pressed on by disillusionments, an instinct which is somewhat embittered, an instinct which has no longer the open-minded faith of the small child, but rather the disillusioned attitude of maturity. No longer this willingness, this readiness to believe all good things, but a certain suspicion, a fear that all pretenses conceal ulterior motives, or perhaps the continual fear of being hurt again, of further disillusionment involved in spiritual conviction. We know from the writings of Boethius and others that this disillusionment was strong in these early formative years of our modern religious life. If this can be regarded as valid, and we assume, as we must, that all old faiths did not die in their tracks. In other words, in these critical periods, a curtain didn't fall over the religions of the world, and all the old ways simply ceased by magic. It was reported that great Pan died, but we have no proof that this actually happened. We only know that he was no longer to be seen playing on his pipes by the side of the river. Actually, Egyptian philosophy did not die. Greek philosophy did not die. The Druids did not die. They were perpetuated in England in the bards. They were perpetuated in all the later mythology and lore, such as the Arthurian cycle and the legend of Taliesin. All the old ways lived on, but they lived on with certain modifications and changes. And in many instances, they flowed together to form new combinations which lived, and the original patterns were no longer entirely distinguishable. We know, for example, that before the end of the 6th century, Egyptian philosophy in Egypt was virtually dead. By that time, Moslemism was beginning to come in, and in a short time the land of the pharaohs would no longer be Egypt. It would be an Arabic state in which perhaps only a few of the old Copt Christians held any real link to the past. Therefore, if Egyptian religion survived at all in Egypt, it survived in Coptic Christianity. And we have reasons to know that this is quite essentially true, for there is much evidence of the survival of Egyptian religion in the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and the Armenian Orthodox churches. So things disappeared into patterns and came out again much later. And because after this decline of the Roman Empire came the Dark Ages, with almost complete illiteracy, a great deal that was carried across this long, dark interval was born with half memory. People did not even know anymore where it came from. They had forgotten, and did forget, in the course of 400 or 500 years, the entire cycle of descent. Little by little, the symbolism was moved into new patterns and imposed upon new doctrines until the original situation was comparatively forgotten. Today, if you go through a great cathedral or study the various parts and elements of Christian ritualism, you will find hundreds of relics, fragments, survivals of much older pre-Christian beliefs. But the average Christian believer does not even know this. Therefore, it is quite likely that he did not know it 1,000 years ago, even as well as he does not know it today. I finally made a sentence out of that. Anyway, out of the polyglot of Greek, Egyptian, some Syrian, possibly some Hindu, and other Asiatic faiths, we seem to find two or three important groups emerge. One of these groups was most certainly the Hermetic. It is also interesting to observe that the early church fathers, the ante-Nicene fathers, ante now meaning before, not against, before the Council of Nicaea, the ante-Nicene fathers accepted out of the past two so-called pagan teachers with almost universal respect. A little later they added a third. The first two that they accepted were Plato and Hermes. And the third, who became popular a little later but retained his popularity beyond either of the others, was Aristotle. And by the rise of medieval Christianity, Aristotle was held in just about as high a regard as any of the prophets or patriarchs. Christianity became Aristotelian, whereas in the early part of it, it was essentially Platonic. But that these church fathers in the first, second, and third centuries should not have resented either Plato or Hermes is itself an interesting point. It means that they recognized in these systems certain truths or certain realities which could not be denied, or which were so stated that they could be Christianized to the benefit of the new faith. What then was the basic point upon which so much of this depended? And apparently, this basic point in both cases was the definition of deity. The Gnostics had an entirely different definition of deity, so they were almost completely rejected. The Neoplatonists, with their peculiar mystical approach, also found little favor. But the Platonists and the Hermetists found a very strong favor because of their approach to deity as a purely monotheistic being. Therefore, we must say that Hermetic philosophy introduces strongly, sometime slightly before or at about the period of the Christian era, a totally monotheistic concept of God. Now, this is interesting because it has been called a pantheistic monotheism. Not a polytheistic, but a pantheistic. In other words, the one deity of Hermes and of Plato was a deity within creation, not a deity outside of or brooding over creation. The attitude of Hermes is the same as the attitude of St. Paul, the God in whom or in which, and we are told that probably the original of the New Testament statement was also in which we live and move and have our being. Thus, the deity of Hermes was an all-enclosing spiritual principle, and this essentially is also the Logos of Plato. Thus, the belief in one God seems to have endeared these two schools to the early rising Christianity, and to have caused the Christian church, particularly in the period of its great apologists, the same heir received all offerings, and men beginning to look around observed that the offerings were usually similar. They then went on a little further, and they discovered that the same number of deities were in the different sanctuaries, and that the deities of similar definition had similar appearance and attributes. And we must not assume for a moment that antiquity was essentially stupid. These individuals observing these things could only come to one possible conclusion, namely, that there were strong similarities, even identities, between these faiths. And after all, they had had 1,200 or more years to catch up with the idea that the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten had already expressed, namely that there never had been but one God, and that all men worshipped him under different names. The Romans and other peoples under their dominion had the opportunity to see this worshipping under many names. And out of this came perhaps the idea that the basic reconciliation lay in the fact that there was one basic divine principle.